Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Sindhu Blume.
And I'm Scott McCandless. It is the week of July 29th, and this is your Monday briefing. After passing 5 of its 12 FY25 appropriations bills, the House began its summer recess and will return the week of September 9th. The Senate is in session this week and is expected to continue working on FY25 appropriations bills before departing for its 5-week August recess period.
The August recess in a typical election year might be a relatively quiet period for tax policy. But this year, in addition to the Democratic convention, congressional tax writers will be busy as they continue to prepare for the upcoming 2025 tax debate. Scott and I are going to discuss what this year's recess could look like from both a political and policy perspective. First, however, we had a chance to speak with Rohit Kumar about the schedule for August. Here are his comments.
So yeah, the Ways and Means tax teams are going to be active during the break. They're going to be holding, so the tax teams as teams, which are partisan, and therefore, anything that they do is not a hearing, right? Hearings are sort of bipartisan, they're full official committee action. So they're going to be having sort of town halls, meetings, but they're going to be scattering across the hinterlands to gather more information. Remember, the tax teams are primarily about raising the level of awareness and education of the committee members. Right, so that they get fully up to speed on what was done in 2017 and why, and what's going to change in 2025, and then be in a position to sort of be force multipliers for leadership and Chairman Smith to, educate the rest of the conference. Again, in a world where Republicans are at least, have the majority in the House, if not House, Senate, and White House, to be able to help kind of build a consensus for what the policy choices should be at the end of 2025. So you have some teams that are doing partisan things, and then at least one announced bipartisan full committee hearing in Iowa in August at the Iowa State Fair, which will be an interesting place to hold a tax hearing. But again, very focused on TCJA and the, from the Republican perspective, the successes and what needs to happen in 2025. This is bipartisan, so Democrats can come and, attack it to the extent that it needs to be attacked, or talk about the pieces of it that they would want to extend, and the like. So we do expect a fair bit of tax activity, maybe more than typical, for an August recess.
So Scott, Rohit spoke about the tax teams. Could you talk about the field hearings that are going to happen, what the format is, and what's involved in the process? And also, what are they hoping to get out of it?
Sure, it's a great question. And first, maybe I should level set a little bit about recess itself. I've worked on the Hill, and yes, for those who remain behind, the staff who are in Washington, D.C., it can be a relatively quiet period. But for the members themselves, this is a chance to reconnect with constituents back in their states and districts. And it's actually quite a busy time for them in a normal year. Now, this year, as you mentioned, with the tax teams and the field hearings going on, this is a particularly busy period, a little bit different than a lot of recesses. The Ways and Means Committee, as we know, has stood up these tax teams to look at the various aspects of the expiring Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, as well as a much broader set of tax issues. And they're going to hold not only tax team meetings during August, but also some Ways and Means Committee official field hearings. There's one scheduled around the Iowa State Fair in the middle of August that will bring together some representatives from business and from the local community to appear as witnesses before the committee and to hear firsthand some of the impacts that TCJA has had on business, and especially small business, back in their home states. Okay. That will help to inform the committee's work as they build towards trying to prepare for next year's tax debate. And that's an incredibly important part of the process and will make August a particularly active period, more so even than usual.
Is that the end goal, though, to kind of gear up for 2025? What is the end result that they're hoping for?
Sure, it's a great question. So it's not entirely clear whether each tax team will produce some kind of product. Will they put out white papers, bullet points, something as formal as legislative or even draft prospective text? It's up to each individual tax team as to exactly what kind of product they might want to put out. And their timing is unclear, whether they want to do that at some point this year or maybe not do it at all. But either way, the idea is to be ready to hit the ground running next year. And they're specifically preparing for a couple of different political outcomes. One would be if they're in complete command. So these tax teams are Republican. They're being led by the current Republican chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. So if Republicans had a situation next year where they could use reconciliation, which means politically that they would sweep the table and have the White House and the House and the Senate, there's one particular political path for them to achieve their ends. If there's divided government still, then there's a different political path. So they're just making sure that all the technical groundwork has been set in the ground so that they can move forward regardless of the political outcome.
All right, thanks for that detail. And in addition to Rohit focusing on the House side, we also heard from Todd on the Senate side. Let's take a listen.
In the Senate, we don't have teams, at least not yet. But I do think toward the end of July, we are going to have a bipartisan briefing on a range of issues that may affect tax policy. I know that Senator Wyden, Chairman Wyden, has been meeting with all of the senators on the Finance Committee, sort of take in their views on what should be extended, what shouldn't from TCJA. That's going to continue until the August recess. And then through the August recess, I expect there is going to be some activity briefings, et cetera, not public as or as organized, if you will, as we see on the Ways and Means side with Chairman Smith's teams. But I think there's going to be activity in terms of other things that are happening. Look, we're going to have a convention, a Democratic convention. We theoretically believe there's going to be a virtual vote of the delegates to the Democratic National Convention sometime in early August, and then we'll see the typical rah-rah, hopefully kumbaya in Chicago, and the balloon drop, I guess, and a new nominee, and then we're off to the races. So August will be busy, both on the tax front and a political front. So it'll be fun to tune in.
I'm so glad Todd talked about the Senate side, because in my earlier answer, I focused mainly on the House process, but the Senate has its own as well. And we specifically talked to the Senate Republicans last week. Now, unlike the House, the Republicans in the Senate are in the minority, but they still are planning to be prepared for next year. And one of the things that they've done is set up their own tax teams. But interestingly, they're not really announcing which members are on which teams or which teams are considering which specific issues, nor do they have a formal process for submitting information to them. In the House, they've set up this portal that allows a web-based system to submit comments to the Ways and Means tax teams and the Ways and Means more generally. In the Senate, they specifically said, reach out to whomever you have your best relationship with, whether that's somebody on the committee, could even be a senator off committee, but wherever your relationships are, wherever your state and facilities might be, just reach out to that member to make your feelings or your thoughts or your technical commentary about specific tax provisions known. So it's a little bit different than what's going on in the House, and I'm glad Todd teed that up to make those distinctions clear with the Senate.
Absolutely. And so let's talk about one more issue for August, the 2025 expiring provisions. What is the exact work that is going to be addressed, if at all, this August?
Sure. So they're going to be working really both on the House and the Senate side in trying to understand what the consequences from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act really were. So that involves some revenue and some technical issues, but also involves a lot of information from what actually happened on the ground. Were inversions halted, or was the tide of inversions reversed by Tax Cuts and Jobs Act? That's a major question, because that was one of the major considerations going into 2017. What did the tax cut do, going down from 35% to 21%, which really put the United States more in the middle of the pack, not at the lower end of the pack of developed nations, but did that actually have some growth-driving consequences, and what does that mean? There are a host of these questions. Those are really the macro ones, but you get into a lot of very specific tax detail depending on the footprint of various companies and individuals that were affected by this. So they're going to try to unpack all that information. What's really interesting is that as we sit here today, there's some information that can be fed into Congress, whether the House or the Senate, to talk about perspectives as to what happened from Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. What we don't know yet is what they're thinking on the Hill when they say, aha, we realize that this particular provision, whatever it might be, had a consequence that we didn't expect, or maybe we want to change it in a certain way. Once they start to think through that information, then there's a potential feedback effect, right? Where they say, we would like to change it in this way. And then the business community or individuals would have to say, hold on a second, that would have different consequences than perhaps you're anticipating. That's the thing that we're really looking for. Whether that will actually come to some kind of fruition in the fall, that feedback loop where they think through the ideas, but don't just think them through, actually come up with some ideas as to what to do either the same or differently and what impact that would have. That's the really key nexus between the tax writers and between those who will be affected by the laws that we'll be watching for this fall.
Scott, that was a lot of great detail. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sindhu. And for our viewers, we are now 99 days out from the 2024 presidential election, and Congress is scheduled to be in session 20 of those days. You'll find in the description of this episode a link to the latest Election Watch with Carl Russo and Week in Review with Andrew Pryor. And stay tuned for another Week in Review coming up this Friday.
And as always, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope you have a great week. Take care.